Our last speaker today is president of Core Academy of Science, a biochemistry graduate, University of Virginia. And when I met Todd, he was fresh out of, you'll appreciate this, a school in upstate South Carolina that had just completed the rice genome, right?
Well, our part of it anyway.
Okay. And he was bragging that his next project was going to be the Cheerios genome. But I'm more serious about Todd. Come talk to us about the future of creationism.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here. I have lived in Dayton for 25 years now and been looking forward to this week for a very, very long time. So it is a privilege to be here. I find myself at something of a disadvantage, being the last talk on such a narrow subject as the Scopes trial. Everyone has already told all my stories, so we'll see what we could do to salvage something here. You'll also notice in your program, I was going to have a partner up here to help me with this. He's had some personal issues this year, nothing life-threatening, just not able to come. And so I am here now representing solely myself, so don't blame him for what I'm about to say. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, branded. I'll put that in the archive. Okay. I find myself in an odd position. A year ago, Tom came to my office and we sort of got together and plotted out what this thing was going to look like, sort of. And I said, here's people you should get, because I think they're great and they would be great additions to the program, and I can do something too. That was literally the end of it. I suppose I can do something too. And this year has been quite remarkable in many, many ways. I find myself startled at the level of emotion I'm experiencing watching the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health and other science organizations be severely cut and severely reduced. It has produced quite a strong emotional reaction in me. And I find myself rather pessimistic. And I do care about science quite a lot. I love science. I am a scientist through and through, to the core, even if I'm not doing it every day. And it is really hard to watch my fellow scientists. We may disagree on certain ideological matters, but it is hard to watch them have their jobs and livelihoods threatened. Well, that said, I still have to come up with a talk for today. And I also want to say that it is another extraordinary part of this moment, and we are living in a time in which it is becoming increasingly difficult for human beings like ourselves to recognize what is truth. And I don't mean that in some sort of ultimate, profound sense of theological reality or something. I just mean, how do I know what news story I see is actually credible and reliable? We live in an era of not just amplification of all voices through social media so that you literally can't tell who's telling you what, but we also live in an era of foreign powers trying to undermine our ability to know things in this country. We live in an era now where for some reason, our tech billionaires have decided we all need to have artificial intelligence to tell us what is true and what is not true, which I find extraordinary because we can barely manage real intelligence and sorting out what is real. And now you want to give us some artificial intelligence. And I say those things because I suppose my community is most closely associated with that. And I find myself oftentimes dumbstruck by the things I hear. Last year, when the hurricane came through and devastated North Carolina, just a few hours from here, I was trying to persuade people on social media that the government had not moved the path of the hurricane. I was just utterly startled at this. What is happening to us as humanity? And so in that context, then, I come to this talk with fear and trembling. My hands are sweaty, and I am nervous, and Jeannie Scott's right there watching me, and, it's fine. Hi. So it'll be great. All right, so let's get this going, see what we come up with. And I want you to understand that that is my context. I am not coming at this as though, last year when I planned this talk, I thought this would be kind of a lark and kind of funny, and we could do kind of a fun little tag team history of creationism since the Scopes trial. And yet, I find it feels like the situation is more dire and the need to speak is more urgent than it ever has been before. So what is a creationist anyway? I think it's funny. Everybody who's ever really gone into the world of creationism probably knows the name Ron Numbers. He wrote the seminal book on the creationists. I remember as a undergraduate student seeing that sitting on a shelf in a bookstore. We used to have bookstores where you could go and see books. So I saw it on the shelf there, and I thought, I should read that book. That looks good. And he wrote that book. It was 92, 93, something like that. And then in 98, he published an essay where he talked about what actually creationists were. What was the definition of creationism? Now, these gentlemen are not creationists. These are some of the expert witnesses at the trial. And this man right here is Professor Newman, Professor Horatio Hackett Newman, who's a zoology professor at the University of Chicago. And he is the only one in the entire trial to use the word creationist. He uses it 3 times in the written testimony that was submitted to the record. It was not spoken in the trial. And as far as I can tell, the word creationism was never spoken in the trial either. Instead, they used words like religion, or if you're Darrow, your fool religion. Mileage may vary on that one. So I'm going to need a term for creationism, a definition of what I'm talking about here. So in his essay, Numbers surveyed the usage of this phrase, creationist or creationism, and found that it's largely attributable to this book. This is Harold Clark's Back to Creationism from 1929. So it's quite a late invention. Now, I have to say, Harold Clark's not the innovator here. Darwin uses special creation in Origin, and he uses it as kind of a hypothetical foil for his ideas about evolution and species relationships. But to become associated with a particular Christian understanding of creationism, that goes back to Clark's book. This is where it became popular. So this is 4 years after the trial. So I'm going to understand this in the most general sense that I can. A creationist attributes life, the universe, and everything to a creator God, primarily because of their Christian convictions. And as a corollary to that, they are going to reject all or part of evolution. Now, I put evolution there in quotes, not because I'm trying to scare you, but because when a creationist talks about evolution, it's oftentimes not evolutionary biology they're talking about. Sometimes it's historical geology, sometimes it's cosmogony, sometimes it's anthropological development, sometimes it can be origin of life. There's just a host of things that are included in that. And I will also add, it's gotten to the point now where it doesn't even have to be conceptually evolution. It can just be something, it could just be words that evolutionists use that can be tagged as being bad and evolution. And I'm also going to limit my comments to those who've actually thought about it. There's a lot of people on social media who pass along memes and really have no idea what they mean. And there's probably a lot of them in creationism, just as much as there is in any other field where people are following these sorts of stories. So, yeah, I'm gonna try to talk specifically about those people who think about these questions. Okay, so the simple history. This has been largely covered. I'm going to try to condense it quickly here and cover this rather fast. So, number one, we start, say, with the publication of Origin, not because that's where the story starts, but because that's a convenient start. That is also the last year that a book on scriptural geology was published. If you know anything about the history of science, you might recognize scriptural geology as sort of an early 19th century version of modern creationism, modern flood geology, essentially. And that is 1859 is the last year that they are published. And I was talking with a gentleman who is quite a scholar of the scriptural geology movement, and he said to me, "I'm just not sure why they stopped publishing." And I said, "It's 1859, man. What do you think? They've got bigger fish to fry, I think." Origin of Species is published that year. So 1859 to 1875, and this is mostly coming from history of science. This is sort of the period in which Darwin's ideas are kind of openly debated among scholarly folk. And by 1875, it's generally recognized that this is the year when most scholars, all scholars, have come to agree that evolution is a correct depiction of history, that it is how things have happened, that species are related, that there's been a long time on the earth of species development and so forth. And then, during that time period, then creationist ideas are gradually disappearing. 1875 to 1900, we have clergy that are keeping creationism alive despite the acceptance of various seminary or denominational leaders. If you read an excellent book, Darwinism and the Divine in America by John Roberts, he goes through this. It's quite fascinating. Ron Numbers has creationism sort of disappearing, and it sort of disappears from professional discourse. But when you look into things like Sunday school periodicals and Sunday school curricula, it's there. So it doesn't disappear per se, it just sort of shifts its population. It becomes sort of a popular discourse. 1900 to 1925, we have sort of a very early revival of public creationism, and it begins, I think, kind of with George McCready Price. I only include him in there because he becomes such a central figure to later 20th century creationism. At the time, I don't think many people paid much attention to him. But then it is absolutely jump-started by William Jennings Bryan. 1925 to 1960, we have a relative quiescent period. As Ed noted yesterday, much of evolution is expunged from biology textbooks, and I want to say very specifically here, it is the terminology of evolution. Much of the concepts are still sort of there in nascent form. They're simply not called evolution. That's pretty typical. And then, of course, 1960 is when that begins to change. In the 60s, we also have then the revival of evolutionary education in American schools, and then the resurgence of creationism. In the 70s and 80s, as you mentioned, we have the establishment of various creationist organizations, AIG, CMI, and ICR. We'll talk more about those here in a little bit. How did the revival happen? Complex story, but I think it's an utterly fascinating story. So remember, at the time that the Scopes trial happens, we are still in a period that some historians have called the eclipse of Darwin. It is a period that runs from roughly 1875 to roughly 1930-ish. And in that period, you have acceptance of Darwin's idea that evolution happened, but at the same time, a skepticism about natural selection as the mechanism to explain it. So during that period, then, you have lots of back and forth and controversy within science itself trying to figure out how evolution happens. By 1930, that changes. That begins to change because the neo-Darwinian synthesis has emerged. Genetics is new, and people are studying genetics and trying to learn about genetics. And by then, 1930, we have the initial mathematical treatment of how Mendelian genetics and population genetics work together to give an account of natural selection. It then spreads through other disciplines. I'm given to understand that paleontology was the last one to get it because they still are old school sometimes, I guess. And so by the time the 50s begins, there's a great consensus that evolution has sort of been resolved. The major questions of evolution have kind of been resolved. The neo-Darwinian synthesis is the way it happens. This is how we account for the diversity of life. 57, of course, as was mentioned, Sputnik, and we have concerns about communists getting ahead of us and spying on us, and there's a satellite now going overhead, Soviet satellite going overhead, and it's determined that we have to do something about this, and revising science education is one of the ways that we do this. 58, we begin the biological sciences curriculum study. These are the individuals who will eventually then add evolution back. And so their first books are going to have evolution content, which has been pretty much absent for 35 years. 59 then is the Darwin Centennial. This one's rather important. This was held at the University of Chicago, and it was a time in which scientists openly expressed the need to put evolution into the high school biology curriculum. It's been gone for too long. We've got the neo-Darwinian synthesis. It's time to put it back. And then in 1960, we had Inherit the Wind, which we've already mentioned a number of times. Inherit the Wind, not just with its distorted history of what happened here, but its shamelessly awful depiction of Christians and Daytonites and everyone else. There were no angry villagers with torches. We didn't burn any effigies here. We didn't put Scopes in jail. He was playing tennis with his students, and they brought him in, and he agreed to be the defendant. And guess what he did then? He went back to play tennis with his students. Yeah, nothing that's happening in Inherit the Wind is real. And I love Spencer Tracy, and I really enjoy watching him play that part. But that movie just grinds my gears. Anyway, and then in 61 we have the Genesis flood. So think of it this way. You have multiple generations growing up basically knowing nothing about evolution, not having any reason to doubt their personal religious convictions. The 60s hit. New textbooks are out. Suddenly their kids are coming home saying, "Mommy, the most central concept of biology is evolution." Mommy's never heard of that ever before. And so there is this sudden generational shift. And so when Genesis flood shows up on the scene, it becomes a kind of focal point, a rallying point that creationists will grab onto in this moment of cultural crisis. England has nothing like that. England doesn't have a Scopes trial. They don't keep evolution out of their textbooks. There's nothing analogous to the modern creationist revival going on in England, because they have a completely different history. All right, so that brings us to what happens next. This is the legal history. Ed covered this pretty good, as you would expect from a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. 1968, we have Epperson v. Arkansas. I put that kind of in brackets there because it's not a creationist case. This was a case to remove the Arkansas law that prohibited the teaching of evolution in the high school. Susan Epperson had a textbook that had a chapter on evolution. She and her colleagues would either teach it anyway in violation of the law, or they just wouldn't talk about it. When she was approached by the Arkansas Educational Association to be their face of the lawsuit, much as Scopes was approached by the ACLU, she agreed to do it. And it was over in 2 years. The lawsuit was filed in 1966. It was decided rather quickly, and then in 1968, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that states may not require science curricula or any curricula to align with a particular religious view. 1982 then, this is where the creationist lawsuits really start. Somebody had the idea in the intervening years that, well, maybe if evolution gets to be taught in the high school science classrooms, then there should be equal time for creation science as well. That didn't go over well. I was alive for McLean. I remember vaguely hearing about it on the news. Later, I would come to know many of the men who testified at that trial. But the decision was quite simply that creation science is a religious doctrine, and not to be included in public school science curricula. 1987, then we had Edwards v. Aguillard, in which the Supreme Court affirmed McLean. This was a case about a Louisiana anti-evolution law. And they agreed that equal time laws were unconstitutional because creationism is fundamentally religion. What happened next in the legal history is one of, in my opinion, one of the most embarrassing episodes, where we had a group of individuals had a creationist textbook supplement in production that included references to creation and creationists. And someone thought, well, if creation science is explicitly religious because it mentions creation, what if we had a book that just didn't talk about creation? What if we just talked about a designer and we didn't say who the designer was? And so they went through and literally cut and paste the word creationist and creationism and replaced it with intelligent design and intelligent design proponents, resulting in one sloppy replacement in which it read, "See design proponentsists." So they had not cut out creationists entirely. The beginning and the end of the word were still there, and design proponents was in the middle. And that became an awkward transitional form from a creationist book to an intelligent design book. And so when that book was tried to be added to the Dover Area School District curriculum in Pennsylvania, the Kitzmiller trial, we just brought that out, and everybody had a good laugh, and it was all hilarious, and I just shook my head and thought, why did we think that was a good idea? I don't know. But Kitzmiller, ruled that intelligent design was just sanitized creationism and also religious and not eligible to be taught in public school classrooms. But wait, there's more. All right, so legal history of creationism continues. In 2006, 2009, Answers in Genesis, you've probably heard that name. Answers in Genesis is a large organization, runs the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. They were once a large conglomerate of international ministries, and they broke apart in 2006 and became, the Australian branch led the ministries as Creation Ministries International, and Answers in Genesis broke off with the UK office and became Answers in Genesis. And that was followed by a pretty nasty lawsuit with lots of documents put online, looking at, who owns the assets. It's like a divorce, right? These people were just squabbling over custody of assets, valuable assets, I might add, thousands of subscriptions to magazines and so forth. I am aware of other creationists that have been entangled with lawsuits between other creationists. I know of one man, well-known man. I'm not going to tell his story because it's not my story, but he was taken to court over the use of a word that another creationist claimed to have invented. I don't know how that gets in court, but there it is. And I myself have been threatened with lawsuits from disgruntled creationists over routine work in the past as well. And as I pondered this in my pessimistic moment of thinking, I just thought, why are we like this? What is wrong with us? Now, at the same time, I recognize here that there are a myriad reasons that go into this. I think the idea that it's, as Nick said yesterday, the idea that it's only one thing is just totally a fallacy. There is no one reason why creationists do what we do. For a lot of us, it may be theological motivation. For some of us, it may be scientific motivation. Some of us have personal hurts and tragedy in our lives that drive us to do what we do. And I think there are probably neurological reasons as well. I have become acquainted with neurodivergent conditions over the past several years, and I'm recognizing an abundance of those individuals among creationism. And I realize, well, neurodivergents have an overinflated sense of justice, and neurodivergents also have difficulty separating disagreement from attack, personal attack. And so I'm wondering, could there be neurological basis for a lot of this as well? I don't know. And I mostly say that because, I'll tell you the story. Here I am, just watching random social media junk, and here's this ADHD influencer describing what it's like to be ADHD. And I watched this little video and I said, that's not ADHD, that's just what it's like to be normal. Yeah, you know how that story ends, don't you? The more I looked into what ADHD symptoms were, I said, oh shoot, how did I not know that? And so now I view the world through the lens of knowledge of neurodivergence, and I'm like, oh, this is why I can't do things, and this is why I'm like this. That's remarkable. Anyway. But I do want to go back to this whole notion of William Jennings Bryan. This is an interesting quote. He says here, I want you to study this speech. I think it answers all the arguments of the evolutionists. The evolutionists really are a menace to the faith and the morals of America. Not just religion, but just general morality. The ability to have a civilization is threatened by evolutionists. This particular quote is included in the foreword to his last message, which is a printing of his closing argument that he never got to give at the Scopes trial. He allegedly told this to Chattanooga News editor George Milton an hour before he died in his sleep here in Dayton. They were going over proof sheets of that. But I just thought this is a remarkable encapsulation of as Ed mentioned, sort of the politicization of evolution, right? It is not merely a matter of explaining scientific evidence. It is not merely a matter of how does this cohere with religious faith. It is a matter of life and death. Similar quote can be found recently. This is just one I grabbed out of our library. This is Stuart Burgess. He's a professor of engineering at the University of Bristol. This was in the foreword to the book that has the Ham-Nye debate transcript in there, if you remember the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate. And he says this, people ask me who I think won the debate. Of course, I think Ken won the debate. But the most important question is, who will win the global war between evolution and God. Okay, there is ultimately only one winning side, and that side is the side of the Creator. It is my hope that all those reading this book will be on the winning side. Okay. And I recognize in these phrases what would professionally be called dehumanization, right? And dehumanization is the tendency to view people who are unlike you as being less than human, as being not good, undesirable. Dehumanization is rampant. It's a subject of study because it underlies things like ethnic cleansing and prejudice and so forth. And it's oftentimes just an unconscious thing, and sometimes people lean into it, and that never really turns out well, I will tell you that. So I began to think, did William Jennings Bryan start this war? I knew there were people. I can find all sorts of materials in my library at Core Academy of creationist ideas prior to Origin of Species, scriptural geology, for example, and even more stuff in the medieval stuff and even further back. But it seems like what we've spawned in the 20th century has been this incredibly litigious group of individuals. And I just thought, well, maybe Bryan started that. I don't know. So, okay, well, let's look at that. And so I sat down with my library and started looking through books with the honest intention of trying to understand, how did creationists, let's say after Origin of Species, before 1925 Scopes trial, how did they express their confidence and the importance of creationism? So this handsome fellow is a man named Tom Bond Bishop. He is described as the secretary of the Children's Special Service Mission and of the Scripture Union for Children and Young People. He is an Englishman. I've read his biography. He's very much involved in orphanages and producing like Sunday school curricula for children, that sort of thing. That's his career. But he gathered up information about evolution and published this in 1918. And here he says here, what calls for the most serious consideration is the effect while such teaching of evolution must necessarily have upon the young men who are growing up among us, and especially upon those who will presently be teachers in our schools and colleges, or who will be called to minister the word of God in our churches. Well, all right, so he is concerned with education. This is not just an interesting theological matter to him. He is absolutely concerned with how education works and who's learning what and so forth. So those ideas that are central to Bryan's campaign are there. This is The Other Side of Evolution by Alexander Patterson. He was a Presbyterian preacher. He taught at Moody Bible Institute, and he was a first-generation Irish immigrant, born in Ireland. And he wrote this: "It will be shown that evolution is not accepted by all scientists and scholars, that it is rejected by some of the greatest of these, that is admittedly an unproven theory," and this sounds so modern, it's frightening. Anyway, that is admittedly an unproven theory, that it has never been verified and cannot be, that not a single case of evolution has ever been presented, and that there is no known cause by which it could take place. Finally, it will be shown that it is violently opposed to the narrative and doctrines of the Bible, and destructive of all Christian faith, that it originated in heathenism and ends in atheism. And you'll notice here that's from 1903, and that is the third edition of the book. This was apparently popular enough that it went through multiple printings and multiple editions. So, yeah, that kind of rhetoric is found in 1903 as well. This gentleman is Luther Tracy Townsend. He was a Methodist minister. And he authored three different books on evolution and creation. And this is his first book from 1896 called Evolution or Creation. He's quoting T.H. Huxley here. These are the facts established by modern science. Therefore, there is no God in the universe, and human responsibility and accountability to a supreme being are whimsies. What troubles us most, he says, in all this false reasoning is that many young men have lost their heads and their Christian faith and then have suffered a wreck of character by following these utterly false and pernicious methods that have been employed by those who should have been more careful of their example. So again, this is not merely a question of scientific evidence or data. It's not a question of interpretation or theology and how it fits with theology. It is a socially relevant question. And evolution is doing damage to kids. This is The Errors of Evolution. This was written by a gentleman named Robert Patterson, who was also a first-generation Irish immigrant and a Presbyterian minister in the Chicago area. He was the father of Alexander Patterson, the Other Side of Evolution author. And he wrote in 1885, when men made in the image of the Almighty devote their magnificent powers to proving that they are the offsprings of apes and tadpoles, it may be questioned whether the subject has not ceased to be solemn, except as an illustration of the fatuity of men who plainly show their fallen state by the still lower alliances which they seek. So again, not exactly socially relevant, but certainly more than just a question about fossils and genes and such. And then 1872. So this is William Penman Lyon's book, Homo versus Darwin, a judicial examination. It is written in the awkward drama of a man suing Darwin in court for being degraded by evolution. That's what Homo refers to. Obviously, that word has changed quite a lot in the past 200 years. 1872, according to Darwin's catalog of his library, he had a copy of this book, so he was at least aware of it. And he says this: if such sentiments were generally adopted, and by that he's referring to, in the previous passage, what would eventually call social Darwinism, which happily we have little reason to fear, in the course of a few generations, they would assuredly open the floodgates of irreligion and immorality in our land and cause such an outburst of selfishness and impiety as would overturn our social institutions from their lowest foundations and introduce a moral disorder and anarchy which might be long in passing away. So, it seems to me that the way in which Brian presented evolution as a particular problem with the culture and with society is not, in fact, new. It is as old as people are reacting against Darwin. So Brian largely amplified and probably elaborated an existing message that already had a welcome crowd. This is another great example of how Darwin transformed the situation. You've probably seen this picture. This is the Anti-Evolution League from T.T. Martin. He was a Mississippi preacher, and here is his book. If you've never seen it before, I have it right here. This is called Hell and the High Schools. So, very subtle title. Subtitled Christ or Evolution Which? Because you can't have them both. You can have one or you can have the other, but not both. So, yeah, we look back then on the history and we see some things that Brian brought to the table. One thing that we saw here is that creationists prior to the trial largely affirmed the same ideas, perceived the same danger. And that evolution is an enemy of Christianity and culture and decency and morality and civilization and so forth. None of these earlier creationists and their books really caught on, though. That's rather interesting to me because most people will look to the creationist movement is somehow emerging with Bryan or in the 60s with Whitcomb and Morris. So the ideas were always out there in the culture. And I would say that WJB taught us how to make a public campaign, how to use the law and the courts to fight for creationist ideals. And most importantly, he taught us, since this is a war, you better fight, and you better fight on the right side. Now, to be fair, it's not as though this were a one-sided fight, right? So we have, from the beginning, evolutionary science has been used as a cudgel, essentially, against religion. And so I've got here, it's probably way too small to see, those books on the bottom, that's White's History of the Warfare of Science and Religion. Then we have God Delusion from Dawkins. I threw in John Shelby Spong's Biblical Literalism of Gentile Heresy because it's just an offensive title. And then Huxley there, Science and Hebrew Tradition. These are just some examples of scholars who just decided, gloves are off, I'm going after religious people. So, yeah, I might bemoan the dehumanization of creationist rhetoric, but at the same time, we weren't the only ones. All right. So for my final thought here, I'd like to just think about, as I do a lot, what if there was something else we could do instead of just fighting? Couldn't that be fun? I don't know, maybe. War, and yeah, you might think I'm naive in this, but war, you have to have two sides to fight the war. And sometimes if you can just get both sides to stop, maybe then you could stop the war. Wouldn't that be amazing? I don't know. This individual is Susan Epperson. She was here in 2016. Randy Moore called her up and said, you should come down. And this was 50 years after she filed her lawsuit to have the anti-evolution law in Arkansas overturned. She came down for a special photo exhibit. We had some interesting photos that we had recently discovered of the Scopes trial that we did a little exhibit on, and I put up this photo of her, which then I had her autograph, and we put it in the archive, because how often do you have Susan Epperson here to autograph photos? Now here is something rather startling that you might not know. Susan Epperson was a Christian. And she granted an interview to Randy Moore. Randy mentioned that last night at dinner. And in that interview, she says this: the God I believe in is big enough to create everything that we can see and study. I do not know exactly how he accomplished it, but I also do not think he would place all kinds of evidence on the earth just to fool us. I believe he gave us our minds to use, and that he is not threatened by our honest searching to learn about the world he made. Some people believe their religion will collapse if evolution is taught in schools, but there is no need for laws to protect God. Our search for knowledge only serves to enhance our wonder and amazement at what he can do. One does not have to choose between learning about science and faith in God. I think that really illustrates a lot of what Joel was just talking about, that there is a vast array of ideas on this subject. It is not as simple as religion versus science. It is not as simple as creation versus evolution. My own history in the subject has just taught me there's probably more animosity of creation versus creation than there is creation versus evolution. Most creationists don't even talk to evolutionists, probably don't even know any. But you get a bunch of creationists in the room, and then there's going to be arguments breaking out. It's quite uncanny. And yet, if we sort of decide, I don't want to do that anymore, there still is the beauty of the Scripture and what it has to say about these things. And for those of us of Christian faith, these words here that open the Scriptures carry a lot of meaning, however we decide that we have to read them, however we decide to interpret them. And we'd like to think that the answer is really obvious. It's literal history, it's just a parable, it's just theology. And as Joel mentioned, there's just many different views about how to read these passages. And there's far more complexity to these questions than the culture warriors want us to believe. And I would also mention that these words have endured millennia of mythology, folk science, and even ridicule. And if you're a Christian concerned about this cultural moment, know this: I know they will endure this moment as well, evolution and all. I agree with Susan Epperson, at least on one point. God does not need me to rescue him. God does not need our laws to protect him. So these men came here, arguably not really to fight this battle over whether Scopes was guilty or not. These men came here as enemies. During the examination of Brian by Darrow, that penultimate day of the trial, Brian is recorded as saying, they have not come here to try this case. They came here to try revealed religion. I am here to defend it. They can ask me any question they please. And when the people cheered, he told Darrow that those were the people he insults as yokels. And Darrow responded, you insult every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your fool religion. In 2014, we packed out this courtroom again. It was indeed standing room only. There were people sitting in the windowsills. In those days, this was totally flat. It's before the risers were put in. But these individuals had come for a very different kind of conversation. Right here behind me, I sat there, and this is my friend Darrell Falk, and he sat right there. Darrell thinks that God used evolution to create the world. And by evolution, I mean exactly what you would say in an evolutionary textbook. Ridley's evolution, that's what he thinks is God's mechanism of creation. He is what you would call a theistic evolutionist. And I am a creationist, and we disagree on many, many things, including important scientific and theological matters. This was 11 years ago, and we have interacted regularly since then, always focused on our differences. And we have not convinced each other. And I would say prior to meeting Darrell, I was sort of the stereotypical creationist. I had very few interactions with people who disagreed with me. Those that I did have interactions with, I kept entirely professional. I avoided arguments and so forth, or I just avoided people like Darrell altogether. Last year, we came back to Trinity Chapel, had another event. And it was a very different kind of meeting. We were older, and we were more experienced, more comfortable with each other, but still staunchly disagreeing. You can read our story, actually, in our book, The Fool and the Heretic. I'm always quick to point out I am the fool of the title, not the heretic. I think it's doing well. It's been... this is the Korean edition here, so I assume that it is selling well. It is, according to Amazon this morning, number 582 on their science and religion list, which I hope has more than 582 books on it. Now, to give you a sense of what this book is like, here's Darrell. From a Substack post that he put up a couple weeks ago on June 27. He said, he wrote and told me that he did this after he published it, of course. And he said that my views were scripturally naive and scientifically out of touch, and profoundly harmful to the church's mission. And then he said this, and yet we love each other, not because we've softened our views or compromised our convictions, but because we've come to trust the sincerity behind them. We'll likely keep articulating our opposing perspectives for most of our lives, unless the Spirit makes it unmistakably clear to one or both of us that he is wrong. In the meantime, I genuinely want the best for Todd, just as I know he wants the best for me. And you know what? I do. First, I had a very hard time praying for a person who was working actively to undermine everything I'm doing. But I understand now these issues are far more complex than can be put into little boxes, and that we need all of us together to resolve these kinds of conflicts. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, you're a creationist? You must be nuts. Hopelessly naive. Daryl is too nice to you. Those people are never going to listen. They're dangerous. We have to stop them. And yeah, the truth absolutely does matter. At this weird, bizarre, utterly strange time in history, it seems to me that the truth, little t, truth, matters more than it ever has before, certainly in my lifetime. But we're also in a crisis of how do we help people to find truth. It's not just about what is the truth. It is about how are we going to help people overcome the barriers and help lead them to truth. And there are many people in our culture who think that force is the solution, that the way to do it is by law or by police forces, arresting people, silencing people, shaming people. And I think that's pretty lousy. Honestly, I think if the only way that you can promote your ideas is through force, then your ideas are pretty much a failure. Sorry, but I just think that's right. If that's the only thing you got left, if you've given me all your good arguments and now you're just going to put me in jail because I don't agree with you, well, you just failed. You just failed. Good ideas are attractive. They are going to be compelling and they're going to be adopted. So maybe we need to be re-looking at our ideas. If they don't really persuade, then maybe it's not the problem of the other people. Maybe it's our ideas that are the problem. And more than that, beyond just the ideas, I think that people matter, and that if our answer to disagreement is violence and force, then again, we have failed morally. And I say that not just randomly, but here's the sermon part. This is the words of Jesus. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. That seems pretty simple. If I want to be respected, I should respect you. If I want to be heard, I should hear you. If I want to have a really interesting conversation about fossils, then I should just shut up and listen, because I'm not a fossilosopher. And if you don't really appreciate this, I translated it for you. Reciprocal altruism conveys an advantage in group selection. I'm bilingual, as you see. And that's really it. That's my message. I don't have to participate in this. I know there may come a time when force is unavoidable in our country, but right now is not that time yet. And I don't have to be part of the problem. Maybe I can just be, a peaceful person who really wants to wrestle with his faith and the evidence for evolution and come to some meaningful conclusion. And maybe you could join me in that. That'd be great too. So I definitely want to acknowledge Rhea Heritage for giving me this very kind opportunity, and especially all the committee members who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes, getting stuff ready for this. I know what a gargantuan task that has been, and I definitely want to thank all of the supporters of of Core Academy who make my work possible, and especially my wife for reminding me a few days ago how I needed to end this talk, not in utter pessimistic despair, but in great hope that the gospel brings. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Are there any questions for Todd?
Yes.
I absolutely love the way you gave us a concise definition of,
Creationist, yeah. Mhm.
could you please do the same thing for evolutionists?
I'd have to give it some thought. I probably could come up with one. Because I don't think it's quite so easy though, because I don't think it reduces very simply. And here's the thing, evolutionists, as Jeannie mentioned this morning, there is the reality. We're realists as scientists. So everything that we believe about science is entirely contingent on that reality. And it might change tomorrow. And so even if I could give you a definition of evolutionist, it might be different literally next week. I mean, I had no idea that last month I would wake up to news that we finally put a face on the Denisovans. And I know that might not mean much to you, but Denisovans were a population of hominin that were only known by genomics, and a few fragmentary fossils and a couple of mandibles. And then last month we have a face for them, which is remarkable. Now that doesn't change everything that we know about evolution. That doesn't cause us to rewrite the textbooks, but ultimately it just sort of illustrates that whatever you think evolution is now, it's going to be different in a month. And to me, that is the most extraordinary part about science. For Ken Ham, that is the failure of science. It's always changing. But for me, that is the best part. It's always changing. You're always learning something new. You're always discovering something more. In 2015, they brought out the Dinaledi chamber and New Horizons, and I was completely blown away. I don't know how to explain most of that data, but it's extraordinary to see it. And I'm privileged to be alive at this time in history when we can shoot a piano-sized probe into space for 10 years and bring back pictures of Pluto. Crazy stuff. Other questions? Jeannie, did I do okay? I mention her only because she is a renowned expert on creationism, and it is only slightly intimidating to be giving a talk on this topic.
You know I'm not scary.
No, I heard you talk in 2009 at the Evolution Conference at the University of Idaho, and I remember walking in there very apprehensive and thinking, I don't know about this. I don't know about this woman. She doesn't like creationists. And I sat there and I found myself largely in agreement with everything you said. And so I left thinking, well, that wasn't so bad at all. Mostly you talked about bad science journalism and why it needs to change and why it leads to the spawning of creationist mythology. So I was like, yeah, that's right. She's right.
I think you're absolutely correct that a spirit of comedy is absolutely essential. I can think the science of creation science is terrible, and I can go out for a cup of coffee with Rhea.
Well,
Can I try a definition of evolution for this lady?
yes, please do. Yeah, please do.
Kindergarten students.
Uh-huh.
They're all teachers, right? Yes. All right. Evolution is the idea that the universe has changed cumulatively through time.
Mm-hmm.
That astronomical, geological, biological characteristics of this universe have changed through time. That differs from special creationism, which is the idea that the universe is largely the same as it was at creation, with small differences. There have been supernovas and changes within time, but they are two very, very different things. And biological evolution specifically is the idea that living things share common ancestors, which is different from how these changes are brought about, for which there are a number of different mechanisms. And there's a great deal of confusion between, especially the mechanism of natural selection which caused problems with people believing it explained eugenics and brought about all kinds of social Darwinism stuff. And the basic idea of living things have common ancestors. And so it's important to separate components of the various kinds of evolution. But the idea that the universe is cumulatively changed is very different from the idea of special creation. More or less, do you agree?
I'm not going to fight you.
Thank you for a wonderful conference.
Thank you all for coming.
And maybe 100 years from now, we can do it again. What do you say?
Thank you all. Have a great day. If you're planning to stick around, we'll have some beautiful automobiles up on out here tomorrow and late tomorrow night, Saturday. Thanks again.